Lost Media presents Inside the Crime Files with Anne-Marie Schubert.
This is how investigators now piece the events together. She was 7 months pregnant and thinking about taking a leave of absence. She was last seen walking toward the northwest parking lot stairway to an upper-level parking area. Mrs. Chu's car wasn't found until Thursday morning, but police strongly believe it was seen Tuesday evening driving near the intersection of 15th and X Streets. Mike Boyd for Channel 3 reports, Sacramento.
I knew general details, but I didn't know all the graphics, and I did go to the trial with my father. I knew prior to doing the trial that it would be graphic and it would have everything that had happened.
I am Anne-Marie Schubert, and this is Inside the Crime Files.
Inside the Crime Files is produced by Lost Media in San Diego, California.
Welcome to Inside the Crime Files. I am Anne-Marie Schubert. This podcast takes listeners inside and behind the scenes of the investigation and the prosecution of some of the most notorious and horrific cases in California history. This week, we examine a cold case from 1979, the kidnap, rape, and murder of Eva Chu. Eva Chu was 7 months pregnant, married with an 18-month-old daughter when she was murdered in 1979. When I started the cold case unit in 2002, every homicide detective from Sacramento Police Department and every retired homicide detective said the same thing: this case needs to be solved. I had a chance to sit down with our guest today, Dick Woods, retired homicide detective from the Sacramento Police Department. We talked about the events and the memories from this case. Here is the conversation we had, and later in the podcast, you'll hear directly from Eva's surviving daughter, Dana. Let's take a listen. I am joined today by retired homicide detective Dick Woods from Sacramento Police Department. We're here today to talk about the 1979 kidnap, rape, murder of a woman by the name of Eva Chu. So first off, I'll start with a good morning to Dick Woods.
Good morning.
Before we, and I'm going to call you Dick because we've known each other for a long time.
Yes.
I think over 20 years now.
Over 20 years.
Before we kind of start talking about the case itself, tell us about your background. What years did you work? That kind of stuff.
I joined Sacramento City Police Department in '68, and I worked there for 36 years.
Okay, so what was that? If I do the math, that's 2004.
I got injured, and I was still there. Had a good career for 36 years, and finally had to quit on an industrial injury.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the kinds of cases that you worked on.
Well, after my first 3 years, I went to detectives and stayed there the rest of my career. And that career meant all details, all different types of crimes, and then eventually into homicide for 17 years.
Okay.
Until I retired.
Okay, so obviously spent many years doing homicide investigations, right?
Yes.
During those 17 years, I don't know if you can estimate or not, how many homicides do you think you were part of in terms of investigations?
I testified that I participated in approximately 350 homicides, not from start to finish, but participated in the investigations and helping outside agencies.
Okay.
It was over 350.
Tell us, what is it like to be a homicide investigator on a personal level, at being involved in hundreds of cases?
Sometimes it's very tough. Sometimes it's very rewarding. Sometimes it's very hard to go home and not take it with you. Sometimes it's very hard to try to sleep and you can't.
Right.
Do you ever have flashbacks when you're driving around Sacramento?
Yeah, I can't go anywhere in Sacramento County without reminders. And I always end up telling the wife I such and such happened there, and
Right.
you never forget. And
Is there something you've learned about perpetrators, the killers over the 36 years you worked, in terms of similar patterns or anything like that?
well, there's a difference. Stranger abductions, I've learned a lot because I did quite a bit of studying on them. They're not that often, but when they do happen, they usually stay with you. They stay unsolved.
Right.
And you learn from experience. You learn from reading from other investigators.
So is there anything, you had mentioned something to me before we started the podcast about something you learned about some of these perpetrators?
Well, I did learn on such as this case, stranger abductions, that oftentimes the perpetrator, if you take the components of a stranger abduction, such as where the crime, in this case, where the victim's vehicle was deposited, and in this case, where the victim's remains were deposited, I learned that the perpetrator will oftentimes live, work, or play within a short distance of one of those components.
You and I have known each other over 20 years on dealing with cold cases. This concept of what's called geographic profiling, which is a similar thing. It's you look about a radius of maybe a mile from where this happened, and you start looking for that. You look for where they lived, where they worked, as you said, maybe perhaps where they play. And it is not always the case, but sometimes the case that that's what you find, right?
That's true. And in this case, two of the components category, live, work, or play.
So let's just, before we talk about this case, and I'm going to refer to it as Eva, her name is Eva Chu. You and I got to know each other well over 20 years ago, right? Tell the listeners kind of how we kind of came into working together.
While she was with the district attorney's office.
Me? You're talking about me?
Yes.
Okay.
She started the cold case procedures, and at that time, our department had no cold case unit or workers, and we got on board with her. And from that day on, it changed everything. We've solved, or the department has solved so many unsolved cases. That's where I remember the first day she was assigned to homicide, and then eventually she started developing plans for cold case units, and it blossomed from there.
Right. I mean, I definitely remember this case and a lot of cases that you worked on. So I want to kind of start off with explaining to the listeners what this case is. And when we started the cold case unit, it was around 2001 or so. When I went around, just for the listeners' purposes, what we did is, I understood DNA at the time because I'd had cases. So we went around to all the law enforcement partners in Sacramento and we pitched this idea. We want to start a cold case unit. We want to solve crimes with DNA because it was the new and emerging tool that was going to help us. We went to Sac PD and we asked all the detectives, the homicide detectives, both current and retired, tell us which ones are at the top of the list that are unsolved. And without fail, Eva Chu was at the top of the list.
That would be one of the very at the top, yes.
So tell us, I know why, but tell the listeners, why was this at the top of the list for every homicide detective?
This was involving a hardworking, dedicated state employee, 7 months pregnant, what you would call an outstanding citizen, stranger abduction, parked in a city parking lot in broad daylight, was abducted, and those type of crimes just did not happen here in Sacramento in the late 70s.
So just to kind of focus in on this particular case, April 17th, 1979, Eva Chu goes to work. She's 7 months pregnant. She also has a daughter at the time, right?
Yes.
And how old is her daughter?
I want to say about 1.5.
So she's a toddler.
Yes.
April 17th, 1979 is a Tuesday, and it's the Tuesday after Easter Sunday. I remember it very vividly because of the photographs that we had in this case of Eva and her daughter at the park 2 days on Easter Sunday, 2 days before
Yes.
she went missing. So kind of walk us through, you were assigned this case when the homicide was discovered, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so Eva was married at the time, obviously.
Yes.
At some point, did you meet her husband?
I did numerous times.
Okay.
And her daughter.
Okay, so talk us through. You mentioned that she goes to work. She works for the state. She's an outstanding citizen, and she leaves her work at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. What was the purpose of her leaving?
She had a doctor's appointment at that time.
Okay.
And she didn't show up for the doctor's appointment. Her husband finally called the department to report her missing later that night.
Okay.
And then 2 days later, we found her car parked downtown. And 2 days after that, then a citizen on a wooded trail found her body.
Okay, and first of all, where was her car found?
Right in about the center of downtown in a busy area, commercial area.
Okay. And then where precisely was her body found?
In a horse trail or walking or hiking trail in a wooded area in the northern part of the town, in kind of an isolated area.
Okay. Were you actually assigned to go to the scene when her body had been found?
Yes.
So tell us, what was that like for you?
It was very quite a complex scene because she was covered with branches and twigs, and it was on somewhere you can't drive by and see the location. You have to walk by it or ride by it on a horse. Mm-hmm. And it was a hard senior process because you have to go through every inch on the ground around it. Hopefully you'll find some type of evidence.
Right. From a human perspective, though, what was it like to find her body? She's 7 months pregnant.
It's tough because every one of us knew she was 7 months pregnant. So it's very tough to look at her.
Okay. So as part of the homicide investigation, did you go to the coroner's office for the purpose of the autopsy?
Yes.
Does that still linger with you?
That will always linger with you. It doesn't go away.
Okay. So this is 43 years ago this happened, just to put the listeners in perspective. We didn't have DNA.
No.
We had barely probably started on kind of the basics of what we used to call serology, like blood typing and all of that.
Right.
But just kind of walk us through. I mean, obviously the case was unsolved for a long time, right?
A long time. And then when I met you, and then you and I worked together, and it was the top case we wanted to start with. And
so before we reopened it, I think it was sometime around the beginning of 2002 or so. But had you had contact with, at the early phases when Eva's body had been found, you met with the family, right?
Yes.
Is there anything about that other than the devastation to that family that still sticks out in your head?
Two things that really stuck with me and are still there today was her daughter. Then I remember specifically how, if I may use the word fragile, her husband was. Very fragile.
Did he know at the time of her death, did he know the gender of the baby?
No, he did not.
Okay. And so it wasn't until the autopsy it was revealed that she was pregnant with a girl.
Yes, correct.
Okay. So let's now kind of fast forward. Obviously, I have no doubt that Sac PD did everything in their humanly possible means to solve it over the years, right?
Yes,
And so then we fast forward, this amazing tool called DNA kind of comes into the world. That's how you and I interacted first
Yes.
on this case. Okay. So I have a very vivid memory around 2002 of going with you to the property warehouse at Sac PD. Tell the listeners what happened.
we opened up with the assistance of a property clerk. We examined all evidence collected during this and repackaged her clothing,
Right.
and to be resubmitted to the Sacramento Crime Lab. And we started over again with the evidence.
There was evidence collected from her body, her clothes, her underwear, the autopsy kit.
Yes,
All of those then went to the crime lab for DNA testing.
yes,
And after that testing was done, got a DNA profile from the killer. And that DNA profile was put into what we call the convicted offender data bank, which for the listeners' purposes, in virtually every state, DNA is collected from felons, and that is then searched continuously against crime scene samples. So in 2002, October, that DNA profile that was recovered from Eva's body was matched to a person in prison, right?
correct.
And what's interesting to me when I kind of looked back over this case in preparation for today is that at the time of that search, so basically, the crime scene sample is being searched against that felon data bank. At that time in 2002, 20 years ago, there was about 200,000 felons in that data bank. Today, it's astronomically more. So it just tells me the value of that, right? So tell us a little bit. So the DNA match comes back to a person named Joseph Aguyao, right?
Yes.
Okay, tell us when you got that, when you got the information that we matched it to somebody, first of all, what did you know about Mr. Aguyao once you?
And we each saw that he was what we would describe as a career criminal, in and out of prison with a very lengthy record.
Right. To go back in time, at the time that she went missing, when she was kidnapped, there were witnesses that had given general descriptions that matched Joseph Aguyao.
Correct.
Okay. The hair, the eyes, the physical structure. At the time that Eva was kidnapped in 1979, April 79, was Aguyao the perpetrator? Was he on parole at the time?
Yes, he was.
What did you learn about that?
He had been released from prison approximately 4 months earlier and was on parole at the time of the abduction.
Okay. So then when we got the DNA match in 2002, what was he in prison for at that time?
We had another case at the time. I did not participate in this case, where another woman was abducted and choked, strangled, and put in the trunk of a car and left for dead. Some officers were driving by and saw the trunk lid move and subsequently recovered. The fire department arrived and brought her back. She lived and survived, and he went to prison for
Trying to kill her.
Trying to kill her.
So we get the DNA match in 2002. Just to give the listeners kind of a perspective here. You were working on this case. Another investigator by the name of Derek Greenwood from our office, the DA's office, worked on it. I will never forget traveling up to the prison he was at, which was up in Susanville. It's called High Desert State Prison. I went with Detective Greenwood. I went kind of as just the assistant. I wasn't there to be an investigator. I was there just to kind of observe and listen. And you mentioned earlier this concept of, and you're right on this one for sure, because what was revealed was that he lived right there.
He lived 5 blocks from where her car was found.
Okay. And
And
that was figured out through his parole, right? His parole agent was able to give you an address.
That and traffic citation.
Okay.
And he worked at a horseman's arena not far from where Eva Chu was found in the wooded area.
Right.
So 2 components fell into that.
What was interesting for me, I'm not an investigator, but I've been involved enough with them to see, how investigations work and strategies by law enforcement. And when Detective Greenwood and I went up there, sitting here today, I still remember it vividly because I was literally 3 feet from a guy who had kidnapped, raped, and murdered a pregnant woman. That's something I forget. So let's go back again. We got the DNA hit. You and I obviously were incredibly relieved that we've identified this person. But then you and I had lots of conversations that we, 20 years after this crime, it's actually 23 years after the crime, we had to tell her family. So kind of
Yes.
maybe walk the listeners through what was that like? Because you and I we did this together, right?
You and I traveled and contacted him at his place of employment, took him into a private room and told him that we had successfully identified the perpetrator. And you never forget that when he breaks down crying. And like I said, he was a very fragile man. We determined that right at the first part of the crime 20 years earlier. We decided to keep some details from him because we felt he was so fragile.
Right.
And it's that day's very vivid in my memory too, in him in the private room of where he worked.
So for me, I feel the same way. It's been 20 something years since we had this conversation. And what I remember very distinctly was he took us into a storage closet.
Yes.
And because there was no place else to talk.
At a market, it was small storage room at a market.
Right. And he was, as you said, fragile is probably the best way. Now, remember, this is 20 plus years. And he looked at us and he said, well, this was just all my fault. And I remember saying, oh my goodness, why would you ever think that? And he just said, because I was supposed to take her to the doctor that day.
He also said he had taken her to every prior doctor's visit. On this one occasion, it came up without much notice and he couldn't get off work. So he blamed himself for this happening.
Yeah, it was a moment for me that really is a guiding light on why we do this work, because of the human toll that it takes on people.
Yes.
We lost my mother April 21st, 1979. So even though I was a year and a half, she still has a huge part of my life. Just as a part of her absence, missing her. I knew general details, but I didn't know all the graphics, and I did go to a trial with my father. I knew prior to going to the trial that it would be graphic and it would have everything that had happened. I don't think anything could prepare anyone for what I saw. And there was always a hole that, in my heart that was my mother. And there's times when I was growing up, my father and I, we went to the cemetery a lot because that's where we could visit with my mother and my baby sister who wasn't born at the time yet. So the child, I remember going to the cemetery pretty frequently. She was buried in Sacramento, so it was always a frequent visit. no matter what time of year. And to this day, that's a place I still go to. Kind of a one-way conversation sometimes. That it happened to someone innocent. My mother and baby sister. Say, where's the justice in this world? You know? I don't want anything happening to any other person that happened to my family.
So let's get back to kind of the case. Mr. Aguyao was arrested and prosecuted, right?
Yeah.
I was not the prosecutor. Ernest Sartell, who's now a judge in Sacramento, very capable, very good lawyer, did the trial, right?
Top notch.
Top notch, a good way to put it. Did you testify at the trial?
Yes.
Okay. And this whole concept of living, working, and playing, was that something that you had actually testified about?
Yes.
Okay. And it all came to kind of reality, though, that those three things really did play a part here.
Yeah, two of the three things played a part.
Yeah, because we don't know where
I was able to tell the jury that.
So I want to just kind of go back to just the realities of this case for you. Just tell the listeners, because you talked about, as a homicide investigator, 350 cases, that there's certain things that you're not going to forget. You know, where was her car found?
It was found in a busy part of town, and it was parked beside a business. However, it wasn't parked directly beside it. It was parked a little ways back from the distance so that it didn't stand out.
Right.
And was within 5 blocks walking distance of where he was residing. Busy area, and you could park a car there and nobody's gonna pay attention to you parking it there.
Right. Been retired now almost 20 years, right?
Yes.
To this day, if you go over, the car was found on basically 27th and Broadway in
Yes.
Sacramento, right?
Broadway is a major busy street.
So as you live your retirement life, does it still hit you when you're over in that area?
Every time I drive by that area, which is frequent, you look over.
Right. And then
you remember.
I still remember cases. If I've prosecuted cases, rape case, kidnaps, especially the strangers, right? Because
it's the same as going down the busy freeway, Interstate 80. You look over to the right and there's the wooded park where you found her, or she was found. You still remember. Even 43 years later, you don't forget any part of it.
Right. And she was found specifically near what's called a horseman's association, right?
Yes.
And when we go back to this live and work concept, did he work near there?
Yes.
What kind of work?
I think it was, I don't remember the details if it was cleanup or handyman.
I think he was fencing stuff.
Yeah, handyman, fix broken things.
Okay.
But it was close.
Right.
It was close.
So all of those pieces, obviously he matched the physical description.
Yes.
At the time.
And the parking lot was not far from where he had to report to a parole office too. So he didn't play at the parole office, but there was a third component. He was familiar with that parking lot because it was an open parking lot because it was close to where he had to report to.
Right. And I don't think we've said this, but what was her cause of death?
Strangulation.
Okay. So kidnap, rape,
Yes.
strangled to death.
Yes.
Obviously her baby died as well.
Yes.
And I still have the photographs from the funeral and the burial because the baby's name was Kelly.
Yes.
Over the years, so once the DNA hit happened, did you reconnect with the daughter and the husband?
I connected with the daughter and the husband again at the trial. And I don't remember how long I kept contact with Mr. Chu and Dana, her daughter, after the crime. I tried to keep in contact with them and let them know we're not giving up.
Right, right.
Mm.
Just for the listener's sake, one of the things that I think is important for people to understand when you work these kinds of cases for so long is once there was, he was identified, once he was arrested and prosecuted and convicted, what would you say are your lessons that you learned from this case?
Well, we learned a lot about better ways to collect evidence and preserve evidence, thanks to you. You kind of rewrote the book or procedures on that. And that applied to some other cold DNA cases, rewriting the way evidence was handled and processed and preserved.
Right.
I think that was one of the most important things that came out of the evidence aspect of it. Even though there was a conclusion here, there's never a closure for Mr. Chu or her daughter.
Right.
There's kind of a closure for the detective. There is some satisfaction, but something reminds you of it. You don't have pleasant memories. You have memories of a horrendous crime.
Right. Right.
And horrendous hurt to the families.
How did you feel? The crime happens in April of '79. It's solved in 2002. How did you feel after that many years in terms of it being solved?
I felt like my neck was broken from bouncing up on the ceiling when you gave me the call that you had a hit. I remember that specifically. Very good feeling.
Yeah, I think it brings a lot of hope for cases.
Yeah, and I'm amazed at what I read now, being retired for 20 years on other cases. I'm ecstatic that it can be done. And I remember we had no DNA then. You were the pioneer of it.
I was just pushy, probably.
Yes, you were very pushy, but you were also the pioneer of it.
For me, I think, going back to when that DNA hit happened and then ultimately when he was convicted, I think there's a couple things about this. First of all, we can never ignore the value of DNA evidence to find the truth, right? No matter where
Correct.
it leads us. It is,
Correct.
without hesitation, the greatest tool we found. Law enforcement's been given.
I have 40 years in law enforcement, 36 years there and 4 years elsewhere, and there has never been a greater tool. I don't care how good the investigator is at interviewing or interrogations, there has never been a greater tool
Right.
than DNA.
No doubt about it.
And a fingerprint.
Right. It is the modern day fingerprint, basically.
Yes.
So the other thing, the second half of what I've learned from this case and others is the human toll. I mean, I say this a lot, but there is no starker example of the impact of violent crimes in this case because of what happened to her.
Correct.
And her family.
And you meet different type people that's so fragile that we didn't tell him certain aspects of the case for over 20 years because
we
were worried that he would not be able to handle it.
And the other thing about it is, I've been in the business 31 years. You were in it for 40. When you sit with families, it changes them forever.
Yes.
It changes the way they raise their children. It changes, for some folks, the jobs they choose to do. It changes how they look at the world. When I've said this recently as well, but when the Golden State Killer was convicted and sentenced,
which I also spent thousands of hours working on.
Right. And you probably met some of the victims and their families.
I interviewed Young. I don't remember her age. 13, 14, 15-year-old.
Right. But what I will probably not forget is listening to the victims in that sentencing proceeding. One of the women that had been assaulted by him said that she chose to become a teacher. And another woman who had been assaulted said that she never water skied again because he said to her, "I saw you at the lake that day." And I think for me, in this case of Eva's case and all of these other ones, if we neglect to acknowledge the toll that this takes, whether it's our laws or our policies, how we handle cases, then we're failing, right?
Correct.
So
I've had a great pleasure. I remember the day, I remember when you first went to homicide. You were a 97-pound soaking wet female in a man's world, and
I deny the 97 pounds.
You kind of took over. You were one of the greatest I met in 36 years with dealing with the DA's office, and actually probably 56 years because of cases after I retired.
Well, it's all about passion and persistence, right?
Yes.
So any other final comments for the listeners, just in terms of your incredible career, this case?
I just am very thankful for the changes you made in the procedures with evidence and guidelines, and very thankful that I got to meet you when you were a rookie.
Yeah.
And what you've done with the worst, with this case and a couple other homicide cases that we've had that have been unsolved for 20 and 30 years, and also the Golden State Killer.
Yeah.
No other crime had more impact on Sacramento than the Golden State Killer.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, I thank you for your time. I thank you for your dedication.
I feel very fortunate to get to know you and work with you over the years.
Well, that's a ditto.
And to the listeners, thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, go to InsideCrimeFiles.com.
Inside the Crime Files is produced by Olas Media in San Diego, California.